All right. For this first week back from spring break, to kind of a short little 1 week unit on satire and humor. So hopefully it will be entertaining, if nothing else. Now, technically, we've already dealt with satire a bit because Fahrenheit 451 is considered a form of satire, presenting this kind of unrealistic society that still has echoes and shadows of truth for our society as it is. So, satire, function-wise, get into presentation mode here, is a kind of writing that ridicules human weakness or society's weakness, vice or folly, and its goal is to bring about social reform. So it's trying to get us to reflect on an issue. So in the case of Fahrenheit 41, the issue of technology and our society's issues with technology to try to bring about some change. So Ray Bradbury is famous for saying, "I write not to predict the future, but to prevent it." So he wanted to avoid a Fahrenheit 451-esque world by showing us what that could look like. So satire can be in just about anything: fiction, nonfiction, drama, poetry, and probably most relevant for us, comics and political cartoons. So this is a satire of Hamlet. There's a very famous speech in Shakespeare's play Hamlet, the "Alas, poor Yorick" speech, and in this case, satirizing cigarette smoking, kind of twisting on that play. So, techniques of satire. Satire is meant to be funny in a pointed, sometimes offensive sort of way. So you can use irony, sarcasm, exaggeration, hyperbole, and those are obviously closely related, contrast, or just general humorous language. So here we have another little comic: consumerism for beginners. "Look, honey, I bought something today. Oh, darling, I'm so proud of you." So, really kind of cringy exaggeration of the kind of materialistic society that we have. All right, so sarcasm, spiteful or hurtful language with double meaning. The origin of the word sarcasm is from the Greek "to tear flesh." It is a personal attack, and it often incorporates irony. So here we have a man who's about to try on a hat, and his wife says he'll take something in a fat. Oh, ouch, hurtful, funny, but hurtful. So sarcasm can definitely be a very double-edged sword, and some people don't always take it as a joke. Hyperbole, exaggerated exaggeration. Hyperbole is without a doubt the single greatest thing in the history of the universe. A hyperbole about hyperbole. Overemphasizes to reflect significance. The exaggerated phrases will have some truth, but the language is not really plausible. So Fahrenheit in many ways was a kind of hyperbole of our society's issues with technology. Contrast, to draw differences. So on a small scale, oxymoron is when you have two words used beside each other that are contradicting in nature. If you call someone pretty ugly, opposites, oxymoron. Paradox is a seemingly contradictory statement that actually rings true. So one famous one from Hamlet, the play I mentioned earlier, is when he tells his mother, "I must be cruel only to be kind." So the paradox of doing something that is hurtful to ultimately bring about a better outcome. And juxtaposition, which we have talked about, placing two similar images beside each other to emphasize their differences that they in fact have. All right, so here's a few comic satire things for you. So this one fits right in line with Fahrenheit 451, providing a kind of pointed social satire on the fact that people nowadays, if they see someone in trouble, if they see someone suffering or in pain, they're probably more likely to video it than to actually attempt to render any sort of aid or help. So, although true in some situations, obviously a hyperbole, an exaggeration to emphasize effect. Here's another political cartoon involving some satire. So in 2018, the midterm elections, the Republican platform, focused on a lot of issues: border security, the economy, trade deals, infrastructure, and many Democrat politicians did emphasize just how much they were not fans of Donald Trump. So that was this is obviously simplifying things quite a bit, but the idea that this one party is trying to talk about all these issues and the other party is just focusing on their feelings about one particular person who maybe represents those issues. So yeah. All right. And then for the 2020 presidential election, we have Uncle Sam, symbolic, of course, of America, saying, "Oh my God, can you give me another choice? America, is this really the best you can come up with? Is these two individuals?" On the one hand, Donald Trump, focused on winning and domination and, how wonderful he is. And then Mr. Biden, President Biden, who doesn't always seem entirely mentally with it. And his mental state, the possibility of dementia, was a concern at some points throughout the election. So anyways, there's some particular pieces of satire for you. So next up, some written satire, which takes its own form. This first satire article I have to share with you here is about soccer. I have a few soccer players, particularly in my B-Day group. So this website, CBC, is entirely a satire website. So none of the stories that you see on this website are actually genuine news. It is all intentional fake news to try and kind of poke fun at certain issues. So in this case, the idea of everybody winning, which, the kind of the elimination of competition so that people don't feel bad, is something that has been poked fun of before. So to ensure that every child wins, Washington Athletic Association removes ball from soccer. So they even have a video if you want to watch it. Quite fun. So no ball means no goals means no losers, and with no losers, there are no hurt feelings. So again, the kind of poking fun at our fragile snowflake society, which can't handle criticisms and hurt feelings and etc. So in Olympia, Washington, they're playing a new kind of youth soccer. To address the negative effects of competition, soccer is now being played without a ball. They're calling it ballless soccer, an idea that was first launched in Ontario. Here in Olympia, we've been looking at how competition impacts youth. And it's usually kind of negative, especially if you're on the losing team, said Helen Coyle, head of the Olympia Youth Sports League. So last year, she said, we took away the notion of scoring, which meant there were no winners and there were no losers. But in many ways, we felt that it just didn't go far enough. So we've actually taken away the ball. Keith Schultz is a ballless soccer coach. It is his job to keep track of where the imaginary ball is. Coaching ballless soccer is very difficult from my perspective because I have to do a lot of imagining, he said. Any coach can coach a kid on soccer skills and having fun out there, but the real challenge of my job as a coach in ballless soccer is trying to keep track of where the ball is and coach the kids on how do you keep track of the ball and where's the ball. If this program is successful, Olympia is considering removing the ball from some basketball leagues as well. All right, so here you can see a pretty classic example of written satire. It is presented deadpan serious, but it is so exaggerated and so ridiculous that, even if you didn't realize that this was a satire website, you'd probably look at this and be like, oh, come on, no way. So that's kind of the idea of satire, is to be so ridiculous that it is, obviously fake. It is obviously nonsense. But at the same time, it is kind of making some little jab, some pointed social commentary at our society, which, wants to protect our poor little babies from feeling bad when they lose. So anyways, there's that. All right. Another technique of satire can be to be kind of borderline offensive. So this is from another satire website, The Onion. And I have pulled it from The Onion because The Onion has a tendency to be a little bit more bit more vulgar than this other satire website. So if you go onto the Onion website, just prepare yourself for some very inappropriate satire. But this one, I wouldn't say necessarily is inappropriate, just kind of offensive. So the issue here, it's addressing a few things, but one thing that we talked about during Just Mercy is the issue of domestic violence in police families, that it is higher than the rest of the population. So when the issue of defunding the police came up back in June, the Onion sort of took that issue, the issue of domestic violence in police families, and the idea of defunding the police, and put them together into one really, really sarcastic, harsh satire. So the title of this one is Officials Warn Defunding Police Could Lead to Spike in Crime from Ex-Officers with No Outlet for Violence. So kind of portraying police officers to be inherently violent, which obviously is a mad exaggeration, but definitely could still push some buttons for sure. So specifically focusing on the LAPD, which definitely has had a reputation in the past for not necessarily having the most calm and peaceful police officers. This was their very short satire. Insisting their department provided crucial services that help maintain order in the city, law enforcement officials warned Wednesday that defunding the police could lead to a spike in crime from ex-officers with no outlet for their violence. The truth is that there are violent people in our society, and we need a police department so they have somewhere to go during the day to channel their rage, said LA Police Chief Michael Moore, telling reporters that without proper resources, his team would be powerless to take these aggressive individuals off the streets and throw them into a police academy. If these cuts are allowed to continue, we could be looking at a very real future where someone with a history of domestic abuse is able to terrorize their spouse with impunity instead of being occupied testing out new tactical military equipment or pepper spraying some random teens. The fact that these dangerous attackers and killers are being gainfully employed by the LAPD is the only thing standing between us and complete chaos. Moore added that even minor budget cuts could lead to repeat violent offenders walking free instead of spending 10 to 15 years behind a sergeant's desk. So you can see the way they manipulated language. So they're talking about taking aggressive individuals off of the streets and throwing them into a police academy, where normally, the end of the sentence in our mind would be throwing them in prison and spending 10 to 15 years in prison instead of behind a sergeant's desk. So clever satire, definitely a little bit on the inflammatory side though. So, all right. So the purpose of satire, you obviously can get some entertainment out of things like this, but its true function can be revealed by some of our satirical works. Ooh, okay. So, the book 1984, which you have not read with me, go away, but you will most likely read your senior year if you have Mr. Buter once he returns from military leave. So 1984 is kind of in the dystopian satire trinity, if you will, with Fahrenheit 451 and another novel called A Brave New World. So 1984, probably the most famous of the three of these dystopian novels. So this was back in 2013, so a little while ago, but dystopian literature was kind of making a little bit of a comeback. So the stock price in dystopian literature has had a banner last few weeks, as the daily revelations on the magnitude of government-sponsored surveillance in the United States have come to light, along with wall-to-wall media saturation of government contractor Edward Snowden's accusations of Big Brother run amok in the interest of national security. A British man named Eric Arthur Blair is one of the unlikely benefactors. Blair is best known by his pen name, of course, George Orwell. His greatest known work is the seminal dystopian novel 1984. The full-court media coverage of the National Security Administration scandal sent sales of 1984 skyrocketing, faster than one can utter the words red light camera. The book flew off store shelves in both virtual and brick-and-mortar retail operations. Sales of the 1949 novel rose nearly 6,000% on Amazon, landing the book in the online site's top 100. As of writing this, 1984 was the second best-selling classic, behind only The Great Gatsby. Chalk that up to the power of cinematic adaptations. I can confirm that there is renewed interest in the book, said Skye Anderson, a sales associate at the Bookseller bookstore in Lincoln Square. I think it reflects how people are embracing their paranoia. Paranoid or not, Americans have been accused of being a nation of non-readers. A 2004 National Endowment for the Arts study entitled Reading at Risk posited that nearly half of American adults no longer indulged in literary reading. What with the proliferation of Redbox, Xbox, Netflix, smartphones, and apps for every whim, it is no wonder that the good old book, particularly those works that challenge us to ponder, have been facing their own dystopian days. Many in the literary community have been sounding the alarms about the demise of reading for years. And this is why the brisk sales of 1984 are so darn interesting. As Americans grapple with the conundrum of security versus privacy, that vexing line between civil liberty and safety, they are turning in droves to the Orwell masterpiece. I first read 1984 in my ninth grade English class, as many did. Orwell is a staple of middle and high school curricula. I found the book to be a bleak and gray vision of an imaginary world, a dystopic world far detached from the landscape of my own upbringing. I grew up in the 1980s, a decade perceived by many as a time of beneficence, of excess, the Mr. Gorbachev tear down this wall era. Orwell's own 1980s, The Tale of Winston Smith, a minion within the ruling party in London in a fictional nation known as Oceania, was pure fantasy when I first approached it. The novel tracks Winston's waxing disdain for the oppressive totalitarian government, the omniscient Big Brother who watches its citizens every step. Go out of your house? You would be watched via telescreens. Free thinking and freedom of expression? Illegal. Everywhere Winston goes, the propaganda posters beckon. War is peace. Freedom is slavery. Ignorance is strength. Upon first encountering Orwell's muted world, reading it at the dawn of the decidedly unmuted MTV era, I narrowly missed literally reading the book in 1984 by 1 year. I looked at the book as a cautionary satire of what could happen if government abused its power and if technology continued to gain a foothold into our daily lives. But when I read it, I didn't think it would happen. Orwell's book was more speculative fiction than contemporary truth, an unlikely political warning. But, like many Americans, apparently, the recent events of the U.S. government's accessing records of our phone and computer usage recently prompted me to reconsider the prophetic nature of Orwell's book. So I decided to revisit 1984 to see if, in any way, its author's prognostications are coming to pass. I also hope to better understand why so many others were turning to the book during a time of unprecedented government intrusion into our daily lives. And so, armed with a 60th anniversary edition of 1984, I found myself with a flight delay at Midway Airport. I had no sooner opened the novel than a friendly woman sat down next to and looked at my book. That story is becoming more true every day, she said. An hour later on board my flight, my seatmate, an emergency room nurse from Cincinnati, looked at the novel in my hands and echoed the sentiment. Well, she said, that's timely. Certainly, as the authorized biographer of Ray Bradbury, I have written 2 books on the author and co-edited another. I am well versed in the field of dystopian science fiction. Along with 1984, Aldous Huxley's Brave New World and Bradbury's own timeless examination of the totalitarian state, Fahrenheit 451, make up a sort of mid-century triumvirate of fictional dystopian classics. But while Fahrenheit 451 looks at the proliferation of mass media in our culture and its adverse impact on our cultural curiosity and intellect, I quickly discovered in rereading Orwell's book that 1984 is a much more piquant indictment of government's watchful eye into our everyday movements. 1984 is a prescient ponderance of one working man's awakening from the doldrums of the proverbial office cubicle and his yearning for individuality. Protagonist Winston Smith was Orwell's anti-Soviet, anti-fascist, anti-imperialist response to his own time. Curious, then, in some ways, that so many hold the book to the light and declare its relevance to 2013. Certainly, the similarities to the present are uncanny. Orwell's Oceania is in a constant state of war, while our own war on terror seems likely to be infinite. Orwell's surveillance state relies on technology to monitor citizens. Internet companies in our world are being asked to hand over user records. In Orwell's haunting vision, Big Brother claims to act in the best interest of the people, just as our own Patriot Act, agree with it or not, is employed as a protective measure in the post-9/11 landscape. Winston Smith is employed in the fictional Department of Truth, a bureaucracy responsible for propaganda and revising history to cast Big Brother in a better light. Smith's very job is to rewrite newspaper articles to alter the historical record. The rise and misuse of technology, a prying government, altering facts to advance a wartime political agenda? No wonder so many are snatching up 1984 in numbers that would make Dan Brown envious. Fahrenheit 451 and 1984 were published just 4 years apart. And, as all good speculative fiction endeavors to do, the books examine contemporary ills through the prism of the future. In rereading Orwell's classic, I am ever more convinced of its subconscious influence on Bradbury's own masterwork. Bradbury told me it was an influence, but not a heavy one. Both books are paranoid, cautionary works that use satire to look at serious political themes. Both works center upon a minion, Winston Smith in 1984, Guy Montag in Fahrenheit 451. Both books have a shadow resistance lurking in the background, looking to overthrow the totalitarian state. Both books speak to the rise of technology, most notably television, and both works speak to the power of the individual to change the system. The fact that 1984 is enjoying a rebirth in sales is not surprising. Perhaps more interesting is the notion that in times of rising censorship, infringement on civil liberties, and the intrusion of big government, our citizens are turning to books. The hallmark of any work of speculative fiction is its transcendence from the generation in which it was written and its ability to reach across lines to a new generation. And perhaps books like Fahrenheit 451 and 1984 will not provide answers, but instead only reinforce our fears. But that is what authors such as Huxley and Bradbury, and most certainly Orwell, hope to do. They set out to warn us. All right, so this article kind of posits the idea that even though, at the time that they're written, Fahrenheit 451, 1984, a lot of things about them seem absolutely ridiculous. But since they are set in a future, in what these authors, insist is a potential future, when things happen that line up with the events of the book, it definitely sets some paranoid feelers tingling. So we talked a lot about similarities between our world in 2020 and Fahrenheit 451 that did not exist back in the time that it was written in the 1950s. And 1984, obviously in 2013, resonated because of Edward Snowden, because of the discovery of the extent of the Patriot Act and the information that the government was allowed to know about our lives. And we talked about that back in the fall, and many of you insisted, nope, totally fine. As long as the government's preventing terrorism, they can look at whatever they want. But is there a limit to that? And I would be interested when you guys read 1984 if you can see our society moving in that direction at all, if it is trying to warn us of drastic consequences. All right, so speaking of warnings, now that I've given you a very exhaustive introduction to satire, I have a more ancient form of satire for you, a modern proposal. So a modern proposal, as I mentioned, much older, written way, way back in the day, in the 1700s, and it was by Jonathan Swift, and it is satire. So just like the soccer ball article, where obviously you'd never have ballless soccer. That's stupid. This is attempting to talk about a serious issue through the lens of suggesting something absolutely ridiculous. So Jonathan Swift was Irish, which is significant in the 1700s because England wasn't quite as unified back then. So Ireland, Scotland, and England were not always in agreement about the directions their societies were moving and the respect that particularly Ireland and Scotland received from England proper. So the United Kingdom was not quite so united. So in 1729, Jonathan Swift wrote to the Pope and said, "Imagine a nation, the 2/3 of whose revenues are spent out of it, and who are not permitted to trade with the other third, and where the pride of the women will not suffer them to wear their own manufactures, even where they excel what come from abroad. This is the true state of Ireland," in a very few words. So Jonathan Swift's support for Irish causes, even though he lived in England for a lot of his life, made him a renowned figure in Ireland. So the issue that he's dealing with in a modern proposal is the issue of poverty, the poor people in Ireland. So obviously the poor people in Ireland are a burden to their parents, a burden to their country. How can we help these people and make them beneficial to the public. That is the issue that he raises there. So I will leave the reading of this lovely piece to you. And as you read through it and start to get the sense of what he is suggesting and say, oh my God, is he really suggesting that? Well, yes, but no. So obviously it is meant to be satire. So he is not seriously suggesting the things that are mentioned in this particular piece. This piece is not presenting a true or even realistic suggestion on how to save a nation from poverty, but he is still making a point by what he is suggesting, and see if you can figure out what that point is. So my first challenge for you is just some paraphrasing. So I've pulled 5 portions of Jonathan Swift's speech, and I've just asked you to put them in your own words, to paraphrase them. So literally, what is he saying? So one of these pieces has his satirical suggestion in it. And if you don't get that, you're really not going to get the whole thing. So make sure that you understand what these sections are saying, and obviously what the piece as a whole is saying throughout. And then I ask you, what is his point? What is his point that he's trying to make? What's his purpose? And try to use at least one specific quote, which I don't think should be too much of a challenge. Use as many as you need to explain your description of his message. So that is all for this particular day.